Today is Wednesday, March 26th, 2025, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here with podcast partner and co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, how are we doing?
Doing very well. This is perhaps one of the earliest morning recordings we've done in a long time. It's the kind of time we often like to aim at, but it still ends up being in the afternoon usually.
I do think this is officially the earliest we've ever created a podcast.
Now, so everybody knows, we're talking about like 9 a.m. We're not talking about like we got up at 5 or something. So, here. So, yeah, early in the morning.
Left it to their imaginations.
I should have.
But the reason is we have a special guest today. Mr. Smith, would you like to introduce our guest?
I would like to introduce our guest.
And use the right last name.
I will. That's right. This is important for me. Our guest today in the podcast studio, a.k.a. Mr. Robinson's office, is Mr. Rudolph Opperman. Mr. Opperman, you want to say hello?
Hello.
Very good. Look at that. Already passed the first test. We have Mr. Opperman here for a very particular reason. We're going to talk to him, talk about his career. He's a member here in the Charlotte congregation, and talk about the shape of the earth a little bit and why we have him here to talk about that. Hopefully will become apparent not long into the podcast. So let's get to the music. Thank you and welcome back. Appreciate the music and appreciate our guest very much. Mr. Robinson and I could both say, just so you know, Mr. Opperman, we have wanted to have you here for a long time, just so you know. We have talked about that, and you believe us, right?
I do.
Okay, good. No, we're very much excited about having Mr. Opperman. I personally, in terms of, I know I love science and knowing what Mr. Opperman does, and we'll let him get to all those things. Really interested in talking about what he does, how he came to do what he does, and we've had him come and talk here. You've talked at the living education classes here every once in a while.
I have, yes.
Yeah. And Mr. Robinson has actually, I'll be turning over the steering wheel a whole lot to Mr. Robinson today because he's worked hard in terms of, I say worked hard, Mr. Robinson can.
It was not hard.
Let's just say he's worked, but he's worked in terms of structuring today's interview and topics. So actually I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Mr. Robinson.
Well, I thought we could start off with an easy and slightly humorous question, and that is, if you made a pie chart of how many times you're called Oppenheimer versus Opperman, what would that pie chart look like?
I'd say a fair amount. I do prefer the Oppenheimer over the reindeer references. So that one is way better.
You know, having grown up in public and gone to public school, the kids are merciless with. I was John, so there's a lot of toilet jokes.
Oh, I can see that.
I can see how you would get Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer.
Yeah, and my name, Wally, just rhymes with so many things, so it was always a source of ridicule. And just for the audience's sake, I don't know if we clipped it out, because we do edit sermons before we put them out, but I did a sermon that's out there. But anyway, I wanted to refer to Mr. Opperman. And look, maybe I'd made a mistake anyway, but the Oppenheimer movie was really popular at the time, so I'm going to use that as my excuse. But I'm in the audience that I mentioned, Oppenheimer, and you start to see the crowd realize, what always talking about Rudolph Opperman. But you're up there behind the lectern, you don't really know what to do, so we just kind of continued. And you're a good sport, thank you. You didn't like storm off, crying. So anyway. Thanks a lot, Mr. Robinson. I really appreciate you bringing that up.
So our audience probably doesn't know this, although maybe can detect a bit of an accent, but you're actually originally from South Africa.
That's right.
So I know that there's a mixture of South African, European settlers that were English or Dutch.
That's right.
I assume, Opperman, you were more the Dutch.
Dutch, correct. Mostly Dutch, some Flemish, and a French influence as well.
So you grew up in South Africa, how did you end up coming over to the United States?
Yeah, I completed my undergrad education in South Africa, and the plan initially was to come to the States to pursue a graduate degree and then return back home. I had a company at the time they sponsored part of my studies, so I owed them work back years that I had to go back for. And the longer I stayed here, this is where I met my wife. She's also South African, so folks are interested in how did we meet? And of course, through the church, you have that connection. And the longer I stayed, I just realized with my career path, it makes more sense to be here. So stayed on. So
were you already attending church in South Africa before you came over to the States?
I was, yeah. Fairly fresh. I grew up Protestant, and it was only in high school when we were introduced to the truth through a friend of my mom. And this lady attended United. She told my mom about it, and my mom thought, "Oh, this is interesting. My husband and kids need to learn about it as well." Ultimately, my mom did not come along, and I think a big role that was played in that is that my grandmother, who stayed with us, my mom's mom, my late grandfather, he was a Protestant minister, so she was very much entrenched in Protestant religion.
Interesting.
And then my mom decided to stay with her, and we got introduced into United, started attending in 2002, and then I got baptized in 2006, and the year later is when I came to the U.S.
Okay. So you and I actually first met about 12 years ago. We both went to the adventure camp in Yosemite.
That's right. Yeah.
Just to make sure it's not Yellowstone, which still is one of my favorite ones I've ever been to.
Oh, yeah.
I went to another one that was almost as good. Oh, the Tetons were pretty good, but that's when I first met you. So how long had you been in the States at that point?
You said 12 years ago?
About 12 years ago.
Yeah. So 2007 is when I started here.
Okay.
And
so you've been 4 or 5 years, something
correct,
like that. Okay.
yeah.
That's not for the audience. That was for me to catch up. And that's where you had first. That's not where you met, but you had met your
correct
future wife.
That's right.
So you were working on your career, headed into or already firmly in the aerospace engineer. In fact, I think you were, because you told me already about some of the things you did. Tell me about how you got interested in aerospace, and then maybe we can kind of move into what you do for the aerospace industry. Do you work directly for NASA at all?
I used to.
Okay.
I can talk more about that. It's kind of definitely have interactions with NASA even now in my current role. I actually started out as a mechanical engineer. So for undergrad, I studied mechanical, and always had an interest in aircraft. I wanted to be. These are pre-church days.
Okay.
I wanted to be a fighter pilot.
That's
Growing
awesome.
up, you watch Top Gun and you get all excited. And that dream got shattered a little bit. I was at an air show once, and I had the opportunity to get into the cockpit of a F-16 fighter aircraft, and realized I could barely fit. My knees are underneath the console, so that if I ever had to eject, the lower part of my leg would stay behind. So
put a bit of a damper on your.
It definitely. Only later did I find out that is probably one of the smallest aircraft to try and fit into my 6'4" frame.
Wow.
But that kind of was the genesis for me saying, okay, maybe if I study mechanical or aerospace engineering, I can design a bigger aircraft that I can fit into and I can fly that.
I love it.
So that's some ambition. Yeah.
That's how it started. And in South Africa, the closest thing to an aerospace engineering education, the university at the time, they had mechanical and aeronautical engineering. Was really focused on mechanical. We had a couple of courses that was aerospace specific. So it kind of left me wanting. So it was really focusing on the mechanical. And that's why I started looking at perhaps pursuing a graduate degree in the U.S., since that is definitely where the
so where did you go for your
universities are.
PhD work?
So I then ended up in Boston at MIT. I started out with a single master's, and then that turned into a dual master's, and then a PhD. So it kind of just, again, stayed on longer and longer, and I guess I was not sure what to do next, so I kept studying.
So are you technically a rocket scientist?
I tell people I probably wouldn't fly in my own spacecraft if I had to, at least not the first one up there. But work a lot with spacecraft and rockets.
So during your time there, you would have been married and already starting your family. Is that right?
In Boston, correct.
In Boston, yeah.
Yes.
Because it leads me into a question that I want for our audience. You know where I'm going with this. You had a fascinating experience while you were there in MIT, because I've always wondered that, when I don't know how to put the parameters on this, but maybe sometimes somebody goes in their career and you wonder, well, how do you manage the Sabbath like that? Or if you go to university with a family and knowing kind of how the universities have gone in certain directions on social issues.
Kind of ideologically.
Yeah, ideologically, that's better. tell our audience about when you first got into it. Was the married living dorms? Is that correct?
So at the time, I lived off campus, and then when I started the PhD program, they have an option or a program called graduate resident tutors, GRTs.
Okay.
So you stay in an undergraduate dorm, and you have some responsibilities to really take care of the undergraduates and see if there are issues, and then you raise that to the housemasters or the university at large. So it's a good deal for us because it's on campus, it's very close, you get free room and board, and we applied for these, and the one that we got accepted into really worked out well for us. It was the only girls only dorm at MIT.
Okay.
And I think to a large extent, the more conservative families, that's where they wanted their children to be, and then that worked out well for us also. But even there, we realized that behind the scenes, there's very much a push, as I think folks in the church know well, of the woke agenda and things that are being forced on young, impressionable minds. While we were there, as part of this role, you have to go through training where there are certain required training courses, like what do you do in certain instances if some of these students are having trouble, and then some are elective training sessions. For instance, there was one on pronouns. We gave that one a miss. Yep. But what really struck me there, one of these sessions was they had a bunch of the GRTs in a room, and then they wrote on the different walls, they had signs up. One would say gender, one would say religion, family, other things. And then they asked you to go and stand at the sign that you associate with most. And it's at first glance, it seemed fairly, innocent.
Yeah.
But very much so, realizing after the fact that was their subtle attempt to
nothing innocent about it.
To mark you as you are the enemy. If you stand at the religion sign, which my wife and I did, and a few others, they now know who to look out for, because we are not going to push their agenda the same way they are.
Right. Interesting.
And right after the session, it was hosted by two individuals. While we were outside, it wrapped up, and we passed one of them in the hallway, and I, tried to be courteous and just greeted him, even though I don't agree with his views on life.
Right.
And he completely ignored me.
Really?
And I realized, okay, so this is what it is.
Wow.
Understood. And
so you had a label on yourself at that point. You recognize this is how everyone's going to define me as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And from there on, you could see that it was just more and more of this push to, we have to be with the program. And Andrew and I just realized that, we cannot in good conscience keep staying on campus and be a part of this thing. At one point, we thought it might be interesting to also go the same route to become a professor and live on campus as a housemaster. But seeing this trend, realized even that, either you're going to steer clear and folks aren't going to ignore you, but as soon as they realize you're not with them, they will go for you.
So recognizing that they now saw you as someone who's in an ideologically opposed camp, and to commit to that as a career or anything would be like committing to all your approvals, all your advancement, all your evaluations being done by people who don't approve of your beliefs and where you stand on things.
That's right.
Yeah.
Were there, because I think there were there long-term repercussions to this that finally forced you into another situation?
So they definitely didn't. They were, again, subtle about not making it blatantly obvious that they are discriminating, but you could tell that any follow-on instances, we had some of these other GRTs later that same year who disclosed to the group of GRTs, the leadership essentially in the house, along with the housemasters, that they the one girl said that, oh, I am asexual, and then another girl spoke up and she is as well. And we distinctly remember that the leadership team kind of looking at us, me and Andrea, to see what our reaction is to this. And that for us was kind of the final,
Yeah.
like we realized, okay, this is no longer sustainable, and we started to make a move.
You know, one of the things that, and maybe I'm being naive here, that's kind of troubling about that is you would think of MIT as a school that's really focused on the sciences and mathematics.
Yeah.
That maybe they would avoid that kind of ideology being pressed on you, but you found it was alive and well.
Yeah, and I will add that in the academia realm, obviously there's the very much a liberal intellectual air that you get, but overall the professors, they were there for the work, for the science, but this is more the university administration and even these groups who would put on this training. They're affiliated with the university, but they're not part of the faculty.
Okay.
So it was, at least being in the technical field, I was able to steer clear of that. I think if you're in other fields, that's very much more pronounced.
So if there's younger members of the church that are looking to go to college, or maybe have even started or in the middle of it, and I know this is just kind of will be your own kind of personal observations and thoughts. What advice would you give to, maybe a high school senior that's looking to go to college next year? Be ready for what?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. You want to be well grounded in your belief. I feel that I'm living proof that you can make it through this system and still maintain your beliefs, but also experience firsthand that not folks in the church, but mainstream, both graduate and undergraduate students they start out and you can tell that they're very much convicted, and then by the time they leave, they've changed their view on evolution, on God, on many aspects.
You're almost a walking advertisement for living education. Charlotte, Mr.
Yes.
Mr. McNair would appreciate
Right.
that. Yeah, being grounded first.
Absolutely.
Well, and I suspect one thing that helped you was you were a little bit older, I assume.
Yes.
By the time you were at MIT.
Mm-hmm.
And being 18 and going into a university setting is intimidating as already.
Absolutely.
Let alone for there to be a lot of pressure to conform to.
Yeah. And being influenced. One of the more comical experiences that I had is the undergraduates, I'll grant it to them that they work really hard, long hours, a lot of burnout happening. And that's partially why those roles exist, that we can kind of see the danger signs of which students are not coping well. But that somehow this culture evolved that they are so busy that they don't even have time to shower. So I have sat in classrooms, taking some courses with some of the undergraduates where the smell is unbearable.
Really?
And
Wow.
I was shocked because I'm like, how many seconds do you need to rinse your body? It is it's quite something. But even that, it's like this rite of passage idea, and these
really?
undergraduates are influenced by one another, and of course by the professors who are think the world of themselves. And then they try and influence these kids in this way. So definitely be on the lookout. It's there. We've experienced it firsthand, but being grounded in what we know is true. You have that sense of peace and assurance of where we're going. Another thing that really struck me was how many of these young kids, they're driven, they're very accomplished, but one, they burn out, or when you find out how many medications they're on that are conflicting with one another just to deal with anxiety and all these other things. And I think we in the church, it's such a blessing to not have to even deal with that, because we know that there's more to life than this.
A larger perspective that
Absolutely.
they don't have. I didn't really think about it that way, but talking about the kind of academic pressure that they're under to the point they're not even bathing. It's kind of funny. We think of students not bathing and associate that with the hippies, of the past, as opposed to your ambitious, go-getters. But that kind of environment all the more makes it that much easier to be cracked ideologically, because you're so pressed on the things that are being demanded of you day after day, and your reserves are that much lower. And so you're surrounded by peers that think one way, and all your superiors and your teachers think a certain way. It really is a prime ground for being kind of twisted ideologically, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you finished your doctorate and then began your full-time work. When did you move to Charlotte? Was there a stop between Boston and Charlotte?
Yes, there was. There was a gap between the dual masters and the PhD, and we were still in Boston. The company that I worked for was called Aurora Flight Sciences. That's where I started working on space programs, specifically payloads inside the space station. And that was quite interesting because you have to design payloads that would work in space. So something that, one, it needs to survive the launch environment of a rocket, and then in zero gravity and maybe some temperature fluctuations. And it has to be safe because the astronauts have to interact with it. So that was between the master's and the PhD. After the PhD, we moved out to California. That's when I started working with NASA at the Jet Propulsion Lab in California. And we were there for almost 4 years, and that's when COVID struck. So we were remote for part of that. And
Okay.
my wife's family, they were in Pennsylvania at the time. And when the lease expired and we were working remotely anyway, we thought we were always planning on coming back to the East Coast. So that kind of forced our hand a little bit. And then when things started opening back up, I reached out to NASA and told them I would like to stay remote. And they said, no, you have to come back. And that's when I started looking around for some alternatives. And that's when we moved down to the Charlotte area along with my in-laws.
Okay, before we get to the part of your NASA career, your astronaut career, not you as an astronaut, but designing things for the astronauts. We're going to get to the gloves.
Yes.
Okay, you guys don't know how excited you're going to be to hear about these gloves here in just a minute.
I when you first mentioned that, I thought, okay, we'll talk about the gloves, sure. But then you mentioned a little bit this weekend. It's like, oh, I want to hear about these gloves. No, I was actually very excited
hear about the gloves. Okay. You know, I hear just a minute ago you were talking about how dangerous these things are, and I thought, well, so would an astronaut need a good pair of gloves to operate safely in space? All right, we're going to get to it. But I thought maybe you could touch for a moment on moving to Charlotte and the rest of your wife's family moving into Charlotte, and in my opinion, you can agree or disagree. What a blessing that's been. Can you talk a little bit about how nice it's been to have so much family around, and what a blessing it is to actually not have grandparents over in one state and another state? Well, I know you still have family back in South Africa, I assume,
Correct. Yeah.
But talk a little bit about how nice that's been.
Yeah, and let me preface that it's not just that we want to get to know you, but that a lot of our audience, you know, it's teens and young adults, and so actually they're looking at these kind of environments themselves and having to make certain choices, and to have your experience, because you've experienced such a wide variety in terms of distance from them, proximity. So yeah, anything you know, any insight you could provide really be appreciated.
Absolutely. Yeah, as you mentioned, such a blessing to have family close by, especially since my immediate family are across an ocean from us. So thankfully today with technology, we get to FaceTime them regularly, and they get to see the grandkids, but they're far. And even when we were out in California, it felt far because we couldn't see each other that often. But now having family close by, the cousins, and we get together regularly throughout the week, just having that closeness. And then also the church family here, so many young families, young kids, at the Charlotte congregation, having the children's Bible classes, all of these areas that are opportunities that you know, I would highly recommend if people can incorporate that in their lives, especially if starting a new family. They should try and do that.
I think sometimes, because we had a move that we made where I had to factor in the location and the congregation that we went to, that was a big factor that they had kids our kids' age. And I know that's not always possible. There's several small areas out there, and Charlotte's kind of its own unique situation being the headquarters, but man, we are overflowing with children here, and it's pretty nice.
Yep.
Well, I see you guys sit back there. I'm jealous of how many grandkids you guys are up to for the DeYager grandparents. My daughter has one on the way, and but we have a ways to go to catch up. Okay, let's transition for a minute here now to your career in aerospace. when I first met you on that adventure camp so many years ago, you were clearly working on the gloves back then.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of thing that you would never think of. So you have to go in space, right? And you got your big astronaut suit, and it's big, and you got your big helmet, and it looks awesome and everything. Although I have to admit, Elon Musk's prototype suits look pretty cool. But something you would never think of unless you either worked on them or an astronaut going into space, but the difficulties of protecting the human hand in a space. I don't know where you want to start off with this, but talk a little bit about some of the technology that goes in the gloves and what's going on with the astronauts that this is such a big deal.
Sure. Yeah, I think kind of the bottom line of it is that human beings weren't designed to live and work in space indefinitely, and in order for us to survive up there, we need essentially human-sized spacecraft or spacesuits that allows you to be in this pressurized environment, give you oxygen so that you can do work either in low Earth orbit, and now with the push of going back to the moon and potentially Mars. And for all the training that astronauts have to perform before they go up, the numbers that I recall is for every hour that you're doing an EVA or an extravehicular activity, say outside of the space shuttle or outside of the International Space Station, it's 8 to 10 hours of practice that you would perform on the ground.
Wow.
So in Houston, NASA has a giant swimming pool called the Neutral Buoyancy Lab. And inside there, they have mock-ups of different parts of the space station. And since these suits, of course, have to be airtight to keep the pressure in, they also work underwater. So the astronauts would train inside this tank. Sometimes they're in different awkward orientations to try and get a feel of what does it feel like to work for extended periods of time inside this pressurized suit. And then two of the injuries that flight surgeons tended to notice were that the astronauts, because you're still in gravity during this training session, even though you're neutrally buoyant inside the tank, you're still feeling gravity affecting your body inside the suit. So if you're inverted, all of your weight is maybe on your shoulders. Okay. And then the gloves, so it's essentially a stiff balloon, these pressurized gloves that you work in. And for my master's research, we did studies on some of the astronauts would obtain injuries both during the training and also while they're in space inside these gloves. It could range from the nails on the fingers look perfectly normal, but it's very sensitive and it's hurting them. Or it could be black and blue, looks like they slammed it in a car door. I know of one instance where the astronaut, he surgically removed his fingernails before he went up to space so that he can focus on the mission and it's not going to deter his efforts.
That's so troubling.
That's some commitment, some scary commitment.
Absolutely. They're a different breed for sure. But it was an issue that persisted, and we found through the study that it's mostly astronaut males with larger hand circumferences that were more prone to get these injuries. And what was interesting is the same U.S. astronauts, when they would train in a Russian glove, the Russian spacesuits, they won't have those injuries. And we found that the design of the glove, the Russian philosophy is it's more of a mitten and short stubby fingers, big palm area. So the blood flow inside the glove is not as obstructed. And while the U.S. approach is you have laser scans of the hands, really tight-fitting gloves, so you have the maximum dexterity, so you can really work in space. There's some pressure differences as well. But we found that this repetitive gripping inside the glove and then releasing, you have the blood hyperperfusion just going back into the fingertips. That in combination with some loading on the front of the fingers, and also you're in this glove for maybe 8 hours, so you're starting to get this sweaty, slimy, pruny hands happening, and all of these factors played into it that some of the astronauts really were getting hurt in the gloves.
So they're not actually like hitting their hand with a hammer or injuring themselves mechanically. It's just the mere fact of using your hands in space.
Exactly.
Wow,
just fighting that glove, because the glove has a neutral position, and even if you close your hand or try and stretch it open, you're actively fighting it.
Wow.
And if it's so tight fitting, it presses on the very tip of your fingers.
That reminds me of Mr. Weston's article, which in the printed magazine was titled "Why on Earth." But he said he wasn't trying to be anti-space program, just for the record, on that article. But he was trying to highlight that, kind of what you're saying, space isn't designed for us. We weren't designed to be in space. And that while we can think of these as very romantic careers, in terms of astronauts, et cetera, there's a lot that has to be modified and dealt with by the mere fact that we have bodies designed for Earth, and they're not designed to do that kind of work. And here, it's fascinating to hear so much effort that you're talking about merely spent on how to figure out a good glove, for somebody to work with.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're outside, how long can an astronaut be outside working up to how long?
So NASA typically limits it to about 8 hours, maybe 6 to 8 hours. You want this sweet spot because before they go out, they have to go through a pre-brief procedure, because it's essentially like scuba diving, where if the being in this 100% oxygen environment inside the spacesuit, you could have these nitrogen bubbles forming inside your joints.
Wow.
With the pressure differences. So there's a period beforehand that you kind of get your body in the right condition to go outside, and then it's probably one of the most expensive per hour jobs.
Yeah.
So NASA wants to optimize what all you can achieve. So really planning out these work sessions, have all the tools ready, do all the practicing on the ground, and then get out there and get back in.
Yeah, wow. So I just have two simple questions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if you're an astronaut and you're in your suit and you're outside the spacecraft, what's the temperature when the sun is not on you, and what's the temperature if the sun is on you?
Oh, so here's where the Fahrenheit versus Celsius kicks in.
We'll convert real quickly if we have to.
Yeah, I think it's like swaying plus and minus 200 degrees. It's thermal variance in space is quite substantial, both on the lunar surface and even for spacecraft design, because imagine that while there's no atmosphere, so you can't hear the metal squeaking, but if you have a spacecraft, as it comes out behind the shadow of the Earth, now the sun is blasting it, and it's just like everything's distorting and heating up, and different surfaces more than others. So there are thermal engineers, and their sole job in the space industry is to understand how these things work. How do you radiate some of that heat away? And then that's also why the suits are white, so that it can reflect some of that energy.
Okay, before we move on, is there anything else that you think would just be fun to share with the audience about your experience in this career?
Yeah, before we start grilling you on the shape of the Earth.
Now we're getting
Sure,
right.
yeah. There's I think just to kind of build on the idea of human bodies in space. So for my master's work was focusing on the astronaut injury, specifically in the shoulders and the gloves that we discussed. And then for the PhD work, we looked at astronaut exercise and countermeasures. Because when you're in space, you don't have this constant 1G gravitational force that's acting on your body. And that a few interesting things happen as a result. You have, one, you stretch, you grow about 2 inches in space. So all of these spacesuits need to be fitted for a taller you.
This is temporary?
As long as you're up there.
Okay.
I need to get to space.
But you come back home, you're back to your normal size.
It depends. So some astronauts, so as a result, you have this fluid shift that, fluid that would typically pool in your legs or your feet now shifts up to your face. So you have this puffy face and these thin legs. So they call them chicken legs. So the astronauts up in the space station, they always kind of look like they're upside down. Their face is all puffy because of this fluid shift.
Okay, never mind. I don't need to go to space. I don't need that. But you see that in video from the space station. You see their faces look a little more swollen, et cetera. So it's just a change in fluid pressure in the body, you're saying. Okay.
Yes. And then as a result, there's some fluid pressure changes inside the ocular portion of inside the eyeball and in the intracranial. So some of them would have vision changes while up there.
Wow.
And when they come back, sometimes it returns to normal, sometimes it is lasting, that their eyesight has changed as a result. That, and then the one that I focused on in my research was because you don't have that constant loading, you're essentially in bed rest. So your muscles atrophy and your bones deteriorate up to 1 to 2% per month.
Wow.
So if you don't do any exercise and you're up there for a year, by the time you get back down to earth, your bones are so brittle, you're like a 90-year-old, and you can break a bone easily.
So that I was going to ask you then, since you mentioned this. So the space tourists that recently got stranded for 9 months up there and are not prepared, like, would that have been difficult for them to deal with because there was no expectation that they would stay up there that long?
I think so, for sure. I would add to that, though, that they are, they're former Navy and Air Force pilots, long tours. They've both are space veterans, so they've been up there a long time. Okay. So I don't think, maybe disappointment, because that's not what they planned for, but they absolutely are able. If anybody can handle it, it would be them. So
what does their first 24 hours back on Earth look like? Can they walk around like normal? No. Actually, you typically see when they land and they come out of the, especially the Russian capsule, the Soyuz, that they have these big beanbags that they have them sit on because their muscles and their bones have to get used to 1G gravity again. And there's actually been clips, the audience can Google this, where astronauts would, even in a press conference, they would talk and they would just pass out with this orthostatic intolerance. The blood is not pumping to the brain enough so that the body says, okay, we're checking out.
Wow. Okay, so orthostatic intolerance is funny hearing words like that. But since what you're saying, because I've heard this before, that in fact, I think for an article I wrote about the heartbeat, that even just here on Earth, to go from sitting to standing, there's an amazingly complex design. The heart actually has to vary a bit because the mere pressure change from sitting to standing could knock you out. And so the body is designed to deal with that. But it's designed to deal with that in a 1G environment versus in space. If they've been there for months, the heart's not even having to work all that hard to get the blood up to the brain. It's not having to push it up. Everything's kind of equal. But now they're back on Earth and gravity is pulling that blood down with the force of gravity, go figure. Mm-hmm. And so the heart's having, it's like, oh yeah, I got to get that brain up there. I got to get that blood up to the brain. So even in press conferences you don't see those aired a whole lot, but at the same time, that you could probably Google and find clips of that. Huh?
Yes.
Wow. Before we get to because we've gone about, I don't know, 30 minutes or so, okay. But before we move on to the flat earth stuff, because I don't know how much of our audience actually do struggle with this particular thing. I did look. I found a statistic. It's from a couple years ago, but it was a survey on how many people agree or disagree concerning the shape of the Earth, and the statement was, "Earth is flat, not round." 10% of the people surveyed actually agreed with that. But then, even then, there was another 9% that said they just weren't sure about it, versus a good 80% that says. So it's kind of a growing idea. But before we do that, and I don't know if we prepped you for this, but I do want to ask because, we'll have some younger people who are learning and more excited and love science. And I mean, I grew up just in love with the idea of science, almost felt like an alternate religion to a certain extent. But some, I think, fear science as if somehow the path down science is one that will always just lead people away from God. And there are atheists that will paint it that way. They're like, oh, the more you know, the more that you'll completely doubt, and you'll finally realize that God's not real. And yet you clearly have gone into physics. You're dealing with astrophysics concerns and such. Can you kind of comment on that? Can you comment on the fact that what has learning so much science to the point that you've actually got master's and earned a PhD? Can you comment on how that has impacted your faith? Has it pulled you? I mean, clearly you're here. We know that it hasn't. But could you comment on that interaction, that the idea that that's not an inevitability?
Absolutely, and I fully agree that the vast majority of in academia, they like to associate the fact with if you're for science, you cannot be for God. And my time at JPL working on the Mars rover, the whole goal for the community there, the science community, was to find signs of life on Mars. To an extent that, okay, if we see there's life here, that means that life can evolve on other planets, so we're not that special, in a nutshell. And my experience has been the opposite, in that the more you dig into the science and understand it, and we just know a very small fraction of everything that God has put in our universe, but seeing the precision and things like the solar eclipse, the ratios, and areas where using math, you can so perfectly predict how to get to another planet that is millions of miles away, and you can time it just right. That all of these things, for me, just show it's so clear that this is designed. The fact that we, as human beings, we can look out from our position in our solar system, in our galaxy, to observe the universe. The fact that we can survive underwater and experience the beauty there, where other, certain creatures can just can't do that. The fact that we can survive with some help in space and experience things there, that all of these areas, God allows us to seeing through a mirror dimly now, and I cannot wait for us to see it all. But for me, having this exposure has had the opposite effect of thinking, oh, science is contradictory to the Bible, and therefore, if you want to be taken seriously as a scientist or an engineer, you should reject that notion.
Well, thank you. I do know some in the past that might struggle with that. And it really is the way it's sort of painted that, well, the only reason you really believe in God is you don't know the real answers, and science gives you the real answers. But I did find, even for me, not having studied nearly as much as you have, but actually in mathematics, it was the same way. When God started calling me, at least more aggressively, it was at the same time that math and proofs and geometry started to really come to life for me. And it didn't seem to picture that, oh, this world works. It just works. Kind of. No, it's like, no, there's got to be a reason that all this really works, so well. Well, we did want to, I hope it's not too distasteful, but we did want to talk about flat eartherism, and maybe I don't know that we want to pelt you with questions. you've already said so much that made me think of things I'd like to highlight, but maybe we should give you a little free reign at first. So let's just imagine I'm sitting here, and I see you here working for JPL. Mm-hmm. Probably part of the conspiracy, just so you know, probably part of
well, he knows too much. He has to have been brought
that's
in.
Exactly
on the
right. So maybe
yes.
because that is part of the argument is that the only reason everybody agrees with this is that there's a vast conspiracy that is keeping all this hidden from everyone. Mm-hmm. And so maybe I should start off by asking you, so when were you brought into the conspiracy? When was it all finally revealed to you, and you were told that don't let this truth out, or else hey, you got a nice family here. I hope you want to keep it. So let's give you free reign to talk about it, and then we might come back with some questions.
Yeah, I guess I would start out to say that I am highly offended that I have not received my hush money check in the mail. I have not been told that if I expose this giant conspiracy that I would be the black helicopters would come for me. And honestly, I've had folks also just not necessarily believe in flat Earth, but doubting the idea of around Earth, and kind of they would send me clips of NASA videos where, as I'm sure some of these you've seen, where these conspiracy theorists, they go all out showing that one blip in a NASA video, and like there's the green screen.
I've seen
those. And they want to hear my opinion about it. Like, so how do you explain this? And in some cases, people don't want to be convinced. They don't objectively look at the truth. They just want to prove that they're right or smarter than everybody else. But the implications of the Earth being flat, and that it usually goes hand in hand with NASA is not real. The moon landings are all fake because if it's a dome and a flat Earth, then
right.
how do we get people up there?
Yeah, and you wasted a bunch of time on the Mars rover.
All my years of studying was for nothing, and it's the implications of the extent of this conspiracy. People give the government, the U.S. government, and governments around the world way too much credit that they're able to keep something like this hidden, and then you should ask yourself, who has got the most to gain from proliferating these ideas? maybe social media or YouTube, who's sharing these videos and they're getting revenue from it. And then also who's got the most to gain of exposing it. And I think a prime example that we've talked about is if the US did not land on the moon, Russia would have been the first ones to say foul and make it very clear to the world that they were lied to back in the 60s. And even today, there's the Chinese lander, other adversaries of the US. There's a lot of, on the commercial space flight side, landers that are actively on their way to the moon right now. And, they have better cameras, HD cameras, and one that I typically point people to is the Indian Space Agency. They have their orbiter that they took detailed high-resolution pictures of the moon landings, and you cannot make out every detail, but you can clearly see there's some man-made structure there. You can see little tracks on the lunar surface. So there's something there. There's a number of things that you can do yourself to. If you're a skeptic and you really want to go after the truth, then some experiments that you can perform on the ground, and we can chat about some of those. But just the vastness of who would have to be included, how they would have to be kept quiet. The 60s, most of these Apollo astronauts are either deceased by now or they're in their 90s. Now would be the perfect time for them to write a New York bestseller about here's the answers.
Nothing to lose. Right?
Yeah, they. What are you going to do? You're not going to silence me. And by the way, we don't know of any NASA program, Apollo program people who disappeared mysteriously for that reason. It's just so many people would have to be in on this. It just doesn't make sense.
It's funny you say that because I have seen, and I've interacted with some high-profile moon landing hoaxer who believe that it was a hoax, and some others, and you see clips, and poor guys like Buzz Aldrin, who's still around, still kicking, and they'll highlight one thing he says in some large video as if, oh look, here he's admitting it, but then it's kind of like what they do with the Bible. But then you look at the whole context and it's like, well, one, why would he suddenly admit it when he's fighting against it all the other times? And there's one that's real popular because, yes, I do get sent a lot of videos, but where he's talking to a little girl and she's wanting to know why haven't we gone to the moon in all this time? Hey, space is exciting and stuff, and because he's a real advocate for these things, and you tell he's just stumbling around trying to answer the little girl. He says, well, we haven't gone because we didn't go. We just haven't. They didn't make the decision, but they'll say, oh, look, he says we didn't go. They go back and paint that. And I know Dr. Meredith, frankly, used to suffer from that. People would pick one thing he says, in a sermon or something and turn that into some vast confession. It's like you don't really care about what the 99% of the evidence says. You find the 1% that seems to satisfy your position. And you probably see that in a lot of these videos, I would think.
Absolutely. Yep.
I want to add to something you mentioned, so I don't run into a lot of people that really believe in the flat Earth, but I did one time a few years ago, and I had actually the person was very intelligent, because I'm to be as generic as possible, knew a fair amount about the argument for the flat Earth, and we managed to have a lengthy discussion without it ever being contentious, which is actually the true miracle. But one of the things I found was, one, that you were never going to convince her. Yeah. That you could, there's no evidence you could bring out or science that you could trot out, or if people want to believe that there's a flat Earth, they're going to believe it regardless of how much evidence comes out.
Absolutely.
And then the other question I had was, this is where Mr. Smith knows me all too well. If you're going to have a conspiracy, it needs to make sense. So, for example, if you want to say that there's maybe aliens that have done something, that at least, if you go outside of God's revelation, is plausible. That the Earth is flat and that we need to cover that up. And I just say, why? Why does that need to be covered up? And if it suddenly came out that the Earth was actually flat and everybody knew, that would change what? I mean, it would be kind of amazing and a buzz for a while, but I don't understand the point of a vast conspiracy to cover up the Earth being flat. Just why?
I can put on my my tinfoil hat and try to provide an answer, because I do try to occupy their space. And some of them will say, because if the world knew the earth was flat, everybody would believe in God, because then you would know that the solar system things are a lie. But that would be the ultimate proof that the earth is shaped like the way they envision the Bible says. But I think maybe you pointed out, Mr. Opperman, this weekend, even though we would not agree with their Christianity in terms of the specific beliefs they hold, but there are astronauts, people part of the program, that actually actively do believe in God, and they like you've expressed, and they actually do believe that their being an astronaut hasn't cast aside their faith. If anything, they see a support for it. We even have, actually in the early moon missions, them reading from Genesis, up in space. And so it's like, well, if that was their goal, to try to, you think that they would almost, oh, look, guess what? It's all fake. You really should believe in God. Yeah. So is that, I don't know if that, I haven't heard any other motivations there would be other than.
They said that at the end.
Oh, really?
That it would make people believe in God. But then I still was like...
Well, the other thing I've heard is that because there's so much money to be made, it's like, we have all this tax money, pouring money into it, and as long as we can keep people convinced it's a round earth, then we're like for instance, Mr. Opperman here, Rudolph's probably a billionaire at this point with all the fake money and all the lying money that's coming in. But I will say, and you probably can answer this on multiple levels, let's just look at the glove. You have yourself, these people doing research on that costs money. I mean, you're being paid while you're doing this research. The materials are not cheap. There's development. There's doctors that are all studying to try to help create something that the human hand can work in this environment. That's expensive. That is an expensive effort. And then realizing, is the whole lie just the glove stuff and the rocket? Well, no, that has to do with every part of the body. There's waste management that the human body has to deal with. There's all the intricate details of the suits, that it's almost like if it is an attempt to siphon money for the pockets of some oligarchs somewhere, it is the most expensive. Like they must get like a 1% margin, all this. They're not getting a whole lot of money. It's there's like a comedy bit that I've seen where these people are trying to plan on faking the moon landing and realizing, it'd kind of be cheaper to just go. We actually would be cheaper to just go than to fake it. Yeah. But I mean, can you speak to that? Because there will be people that say like, all this money is it's not even going into the moon, the actual space tech. No, it's really just going into people's pockets. Can you speak to some of that?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that also supports the idea that those involved are really getting the short end of the stick, because these astronauts, they are civil servants. Their salaries are publicly available, so you know how much these guys make. So if you see him pulling up in a Ferrari, there'll be questions. and the absolutely, like you said, the religious convictions of many of them. But these are also individuals, they are so driven, usually a military background, serving the country, being naval aviators or pilots, that having to knowingly go along with a lie and tell everybody they're in this grand space adventure, but they're really not, and they're in a basement somewhere. It's just not, it doesn't fit with their personalities. And the idea that there's so much money in space, the NASA budget is less than 1% of the entire U.S. government spending. It is a tiny fraction, and it definitely doesn't go to the people to keep them quiet, because, for instance, like the Mars rover program,
right?
It was maybe $2 billion. I forget the final number, how much it cost, and people would they ask why so much, and it's not the building a rover, buying all the parts. Really, most of that goes into the testing, paying people to put it through its paces on the ground, building engineering models that you would test in different environments. You would bake it out. It would be in a clean room where there's no contamination with any germs. So before something flies into space, it has to go through so much vigorous testing. And that's why, if a rocket blows up, you cry a little bit inside, because not so much of the rocket, but how many hours went into getting the hardware to that state. And it's not the most lucrative career, for sure. And there's no evidence that oh yes, all this money is just siphoned to areas where people can take advantage.
You've been in a clean room, haven't you?
I have.
Yeah,
Yes.
really. Wear the little booties and
The
everything.
little
and,
bunny suits or the white ninja suits. It's quite fun.
and to think that all of that you experience, that's somehow theater, right? That
Yeah.
all of that is just theater. That is
Absolutely.
a very expensive theater, for one thing. But would you say then, because that's part of what people have to believe if all this is a conspiracy, that you start off in high school, you start off in college, and you're just idealistic and you can't wait to be involved with the space program, or you're in the military, you're a pilot. We know planes are real. There's pilots, and they're dreaming one day, I think I could be a part of the astronaut program. I think I could do this. But there has to be a time when you cross over the line, and if it's a conspiracy, they have to take you in a secret room and do the secret Masonic symbols or whatever the case might be and say, look, you need to know if you're going to go further, all this is a sham. Yeah. Would you say that in your career, surely you would have passed that at this point, right? I mean, are you at a point where you have to say at this point for there to be a secret above you would just be completely ludicrous, right?
Absolutely. The idea of having what you would have to go through to make it look convincing to the engineers on the ground. Like, for instance, when we speak to the Mars rover, light takes 15 to 20 minutes to reach, or maybe 10 minutes each way. So 20 minutes of light time to get the signals there and back. And if all of that is staged, you could make your life so much easier if, like, behind the scenes, they would just send the rover the commands that it needs to do because it's in a dark room in the other building. It's just quite the lengths that you would have to go through and keep it under wraps for decades now. It's not, no government, nobody is able to keep that going for so long.
Yeah, there's so many secrets. I think Mr. Robinson had in the notes, like in terms of nuclear weapons and such. There we have like world-ending kinds of systems and stuff where secrets aren't kept nearly as well as this would have to be. So it does defy our sense of how humans can work together. Secondly, I biblically, when you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13, that's what our overall theme for the podcast is how to think biblically. Mm-hmm. Part of what begins to impress me is, look, we get it. There are people that have wrong thoughts in the world that are thinking in the wrong direction. There's entire religions that are wrong, and there's some who know they're wrong, but they keep them going. I don't think we think most historians are somehow hiding the secret of the identity of Israel. They just don't understand. They're deceived themselves, and they kind of committed to a certain ideology that prevents them from noticing certain things or caring about the Bible. But overall, to go for such a vast conspiracy, it begins to violate what I see in 1 Corinthians 13, at least as it's suggested. Like when, at least in the New King James translation, it talks about how love doesn't think evil. There's a certain implication in there that you can't be so ready to jump and conclude about your fellow man that he's truly evil. There's a certain benefit of a doubt that I feel like God expects us to give. You want to be wise, right? You don't want someone stealing your wallet because you say, hey, can I borrow your credit card for a while? Well, sure, I'm sure you're innocent. Here's everything I have. Now, you have to be wise in the world, but yet there's something that happens to the human spirit when you're capable of seeing how vast this conspiracy would have to be. You're having to assume the worst, like in terms of outright desire to deceive, not just amongst a high group of elites, but honestly, people like you, even some people that are planning, they're construction engineers working on a building that has to account for, the curvature of the earth. But yeah, even those guys, just blue collar workers going home to their families, not driving Ferraris, but actually, this, what am I sacrificing for, right? The idea that you have to think of people that way just sounds fundamentally spiritually dangerous. And I can't tell you, I got to admit, the glove stuff was very exciting. To be able to weave a tale that is that consistent, because you've got supposedly liars here in the U.S. they're working on the physics, but then you've got the quote-unquote deceivers and liars in the old Soviet Union and eventually Russia that are also working on gloves, that somehow their stories are consistent enough that when they work together, because they've discovered real principles as they're trying to adapt and to learn, after a while, you have to realize that the lore, my kids, they read a certain amount of fiction, certain authors, et cetera, and this idea of building worlds where you keep track of all the lore, like Star Wars has certain details. People say, a lightsaber has to have a kyber crystal. You've got all these little details. But yet, the supposed conspiracy behind the space program would have lore on a level that no author has been able, so consistent over generations and generations, and so minute to the point that it's a part of your fictional lore, the impact on the fingernails of the astronauts while they're having to work in space. And then actors who are willing to come back to Earth and, okay, Bob, we're going to need you to faint at about 2 minutes and 37 seconds into the interview. Then you're looking at actually the greatest work of fiction that has ever been created in the entire history of mankind.
The attention to detail is incredible, that there was even an astronaut that had his nails surgically removed.
Well, that's because, let's say that's because he was actually going to tell everybody about the flat Earth, and the mobsters removed them. That's exactly that's my story.
It's the most perfect conspiracy because NASA and everybody involved in this vast conspiracy literally have to do nothing, and people believe the conspiracy.
And it's the idea that somehow it's to corrupt people spiritually so they don't believe in God and such, and yet there's so much that's working on that level regardless. You could suddenly, it's like if suddenly the earth were flat, is everyone going to give up all their other spiritual vices, et cetera? Well, no, they're just going to come up with reasons that the earth is flat and it's not a problem. So anyway, we spent a lot of time with you. Is there anything else? Again, we don't want to put it on you, but is there anything you'd like to say before we let you go to your real job? And thank you, by the way, for I don't know if you mentioned this, but for our audience, because he's working on California time, where they're working, that he was able to squeeze in this in the morning before his job actually starts there. Based on California clocks here on the other coast, and we really do appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming. Is there anything you'd like to say to leave the audience with before you head out?
Sure. I'd say do not be influenced either in the academic realm by those who are actively trying to put down what we believe, and also don't be swayed by those on the other side of the spectrum who believe, even though maybe they don't have the same level of education, but they believe that they figured it out, the conspiracies behind the scenes. And we all know that our source of truth is the Bible, and as long as we stay close to God, all of these other things are just noise. And we don't have to stand back to science, because science is the way that God created the universe, and it's not in opposition to anything that we believe.
Oh, thank you, Rudolf.
Thank you very much.